Every single day, we make hundreds of small, seemingly insignificant decisions. We choose what to eat for breakfast, what road to take on our commute, what book to read before bed, or whether to strike up a casual conversation with a stranger on the bus. Most of the time, these little choices fade into the background of our lives, completely forgotten by the time we wake up the next morning. But every once in a while, one of those tiny, routine decisions sets off a massive, unstoppable chain reaction. A single choice, made in a split second of boredom, desperation, or simple curiosity, can completely reshape a person's life forever. And sometimes it does not just change their own life, it changes the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 normal, everyday people who found themselves standing at these exact crossroads. They made choices that felt completely ordinary at the time, but those decisions ended up sending shockwaves through history, pop culture, and global politics. Our first story begins on a cold, gray afternoon in the year 2009 inside a quiet, dimly lit manga cafe in the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea. A 38-year-old man named Hwang Dong-huk was sitting in a small, private wooden booth staring blankly at the wall. A manga cafe is a very popular place in South Korea where people can go to escape the noise and stress of the city. You can buy cheap snacks, sip on hot drinks, and browse through massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of manga volumes, which are essentially Japanese comic books. It is a place designed for quiet comfort and cheap relaxation, but on this particular day, Hwang Dong-hyuk was anything but relaxed. The truth was, he was completely broke. He did not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee or a small snack from the cafe counter. He had only come inside because it was a warm, quiet place to sit and escape the harsh, unforgiving reality of his daily life. At 38 years old, his life was in complete shambles. For his entire adult life, he had dreamed of becoming a successful writer and film director. He had spent years studying the craft, working long hours on various movie sets, and trying to get his scripts noticed by major production companies. He had successfully landed a few small temporary jobs here and there, writing a script or directing a minor project, but the entertainment industry in Seoul was incredibly competitive and unpredictable. Every single time he thought he was finally making progress, the project would suddenly fizzle out, the funding would dry up, and he would find himself right back where he started, completely unemployed. At this point in his life, he was completely out of options and drowning in debt. He lived in a tiny, cramped apartment with his elderly mother and his grandmother. Even though all 3 of them pooled every single penny they had, they still struggled to pay their monthly rent and keep the heating on. The financial stress was absolutely crushing, hanging over him like a dark cloud. Just a few weeks prior, Hwang had been forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. He had to sell his laptop, which was his most prized possession, and the only tool he had to write his scripts. He sold it for a fraction of what it was worth, just so his family would not get evicted onto the cold streets. To make matters worse, he had started taking out short-term, high-interest loans just to buy basic necessities like white rice and medicine. He had absolutely no way of paying them back, and the debt was piling up like a mountain, with predatory debt collectors constantly calling his phone. The anxiety was so intense that he could barely sleep. The only way he could find even a temporary moment of peace was to escape into the world of manga. So, on this afternoon, he went to the cafe's library shelves, searched through the volumes, and pulled down a copy of his absolute favorite manga series. It was a highly controversial and incredibly violent survival story called Battle Royale. The story follows a class of high school students who are forced by a ruthless authoritarian government to fight each other to the death on a deserted island until only one survivor remains. The manga was notorious for its graphic violence and dark psychological themes, but to Hwang, it was a masterpiece. It was so over-the-top and dramatic that it allowed him to completely forget about his own miserable life, if only for an hour. As he sat in his booth, turning the pages and reading the story for the 20th time, a sudden thought struck him. He looked at the pages, showing characters fighting for survival, and then he thought about his own desperate situation. He thought about the crushing weight of his debt, the feeling of absolute hopelessness, and the sheer desperation that consumed him every single day. He realized that there were millions of people in South Korea and all over the world who were experiencing this exact same kind of financial desperation. And then he had a massive epiphany. What if he wrote a story that combined the extreme high-stakes survival elements of Battle Royale with the harsh modern reality of extreme poverty? He started thinking about his childhood, playing innocent street games like the Squid Game, Red Light, Green Light, and the Dalgona Candy Challenge with his friends. Back then, the only stakes were who got to be the king of the playground. But what if, instead of high school students forced to fight by a government, the story was about ordinary, deeply indebted adults who willingly signed up to play these innocent childhood games for a massive cash prize? They would know that losing meant death, but their real lives were already such a living hell that they were willing to take the risk. The idea was so brilliant and so raw that it made his hands shake. He did not have his laptop anymore, but he had a cheap pen and some scraps of paper. He leaned over the table in his booth and began to write furiously. He sketched out characters, came up with ideas for different games, and outlined a complex, dark narrative about human nature and greed. He wrote for hours and hours, completely losing track of time. By the time the cafe manager tapped on his shoulder to tell him they were closing, Hwang had a complete, detailed outline of a brand new world. Over the next several months, Hwang worked tirelessly to turn this outline into a full, polished script. He had to write much of it by hand on yellow legal pads, but he poured his entire soul into it. He was absolutely convinced that this script was his masterpiece, the one project that would finally pull his family out of poverty. But when he finally finished the script and began pitching it to investors and production studios, his dreams were completely shattered. Every single buyer he met with rejected it immediately. They told him the script was way too weird, far too dark, and completely unrealistic. They said that a story about desperate people murdering each other in children's games was too grotesque for television and that no mainstream audience would ever want to watch it. For 10 long years, Hwang Dong-hook carried that script with him everywhere he went. He remained broke, his family continued to struggle, and he was forced to take on low-paying menial jobs just to survive. He often had to skip meals, and the shame of being unable to support his mother and grandmother ate away at him. But despite all the rejections and the constant self-doubt, he refused to throw the script away. He knew in his gut that the story was powerful, and that people who had experienced real struggle would relate to the themes of desperation and survival. Then, fast forward to the year 2019. Out of nowhere, a major global production studio decided to take a massive gamble. They looked at Hwang's script and saw something unique. They bought the rights to the story and put it into production as a high-budget television series. 12 years after Hwang Dong-hyuk had sat in that manga cafe, broke and hopeless, his vision was finally brought to life. In September of 2021, the show premiered. Almost overnight, the series became a monumental global phenomenon. It completely dominated the internet, becoming the most-watched show in the history of the streaming platform. It sparked thousands of memes, merchandise lines, and discussions about economic inequality in modern society. The show ultimately generated over $900 million in value for the production company. And as for Hwang Dong-hook, his life was changed forever. He was finally able to pay off all his debts, buy a beautiful home for his mother and grandmother, and secure his place as one of the most respected writers and directors in the industry, even winning a prestigious Emmy Award for his direction. The manga series that started it all was Battle Royale, and the global phenomenon that Hwang created was called Squid Game. It all happened because a desperate man with no money in his pocket made the simple decision to walk into a cafe and read his favorite comic book. It is truly amazing how a single afternoon in a manga cafe could lead to one of the biggest television shows in human history. But now, let us travel back to a different time and place, to the hot summer of 1953 in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. Inside a small, unassuming brick building on Union Avenue, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was busy cleaning up his recording studio. The studio was called Sun Records, and it was Sam's pride and joy. Memphis was a city bursting with musical energy, a place where gospel, blues, country, and rhythm and blues were constantly blending together on the street corners and in the local clubs. Sam was a deeply passionate music lover who believed that the big, established record labels in New York and Los Angeles were completely out of touch with the raw, authentic music of the American South. He wanted to capture that raw energy, but he did not have the money or the connections to sign big-name acts. So, Sam came up with a very unique and highly unusual business model. He decided to open up his recording studio to absolutely anyone who walked off the street. He set up a policy where anyone could walk into Sun Records at any time, hand him exactly $4, and in exchange, Sam would record them professionally and press their song onto a double-sided acetate disc. Sam hoped that by casting such a wide net, he would eventually find a rare, undiscovered talent, a star that could put his studio on the map. But the reality of this business model was incredibly grueling. Most of the people who paid the $4 were not talented at all. They were amateur singers who sang completely out of key, played their instruments poorly, and left Sam sitting in the control room with a massive headache. On this particular summer afternoon, Sam had just finished recording a local church choir, which had gone reasonably well, and now he was sweeping up the dust, wrapping up heavy microphone cables, and resetting his recording equipment, hoping that someone interesting would walk through the door. And then, the door opened, and an 18-year-old kid walked inside. The kid was dressed in simple work clothes, covered in grease and sweat from his day job, and he had a cheap acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was incredibly shy. He stood near the entrance, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, barely making eye contact with Sam. The young man walked up to the reception desk and met Sam's assistant, a woman named Marion Keisker. She asked him what kind of singer he was, and the kid replied that he sang all kinds. When she asked who he sounded like, he famously looked down and said that he did not sound like nobody. Sam greeted him warmly and asked how he could help him. The young man cleared his throat and explained in a very soft, polite voice that he worked as a truck driver for a local electrical supply company called Crown Electric. He said that he loved to play the guitar and sing in his spare time, and that he wanted to use the $4 service to record a couple of traditional, slow ballads as a birthday gift for his beloved mother, Gladys. Sam, always welcoming, smiled and told him to step right into the recording booth. The kid handed over his $4, walked into the small booth, and positioned himself in front of the microphone. Sam went back into the control room, put on his headphones, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a very average, mediocre performance. But the moment the kid struck the first chord on his guitar and began to sing, Sam's jaw practically hit the floor. The transformation was absolute. The incredibly shy, awkward teenager who had just been mumbling at the front door completely vanished. In his place was an artist of unbelievable depth and power. His voice was incredibly rich, warm, and filled with a deep, soulful emotion that seemed far beyond his 18 years. He sang the slow ballads with perfect control and a hauntingly beautiful tone that filled the entire studio. Sam sat in the control room, completely paralyzed, listening to this truck driver sing. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was listening to someone truly extraordinary. When the recording was finished, the young man stopped singing, and just like that, the magic vanished. He instantly reverted back to being a shy, polite teenager. He stepped out of the booth, thanked Sam quietly, took his newly pressed acetate disc, and walked out into the hot Memphis sun. Once the kid was gone, Sam sat in the silence of his studio, his heart racing. He reached for his notepad where he kept track of the people who came into the studio, and he wrote down a quick, urgent note to himself. It read, "Good ballad singer. Save." He knew he had to keep this kid in mind for the future. Fast forward to the summer of 1954, about a year after that fateful afternoon. Sam was back in the studio, working with a local country music band. They were trying to record a few tracks, but the session was going terribly. The band was talented, but they felt like their instrumental tracks were flat and lacked a strong, defining lead voice to pull everything together. They asked Sam if he knew of any vocalists in the area who might be able to help them. Sam's studio manager, who had been present during the young truck driver session the year before, immediately jumped in. She reminded Sam of the shy 18-year-old who had recorded the ballads for his mother, insisting that his voice was one of the best she had ever heard. Sam agreed and decided to give the young man a call. The kid was thrilled to get the invitation and rushed down to the studio to meet the band. But when they began to play, the session was a complete disaster. The young man was still a fantastic singer, but he and the band had absolutely no chemistry. They had just met, and they were trying to play standard, highly structured country and pop songs. The kid's slow, expressive ballad style did not fit the up-tempo, rigid rhythm of the band at all. It sounded stiff, awkward, and completely lifeless. Sam watched from the control room, feeling the tension rise. After several failed attempts, he could see that everyone was getting frustrated and tired. He decided to call for a quick break to let everyone clear their heads. The band members and the young singer put down their instruments and walked out of the live room to grab a cold drink and step outside. Sam walked into the adjacent control room to sit in silence and try to figure out how to salvage the session. The control room did not have a window looking into the live booth, so he was completely cut off from seeing what was happening in there. But then, through the heavy walls of the studio, Sam heard a faint sound. It turns out that the young singer had gone back into the recording booth alone while the band was still outside. He had picked up his acoustic guitar and started playing an old blues song called That's All Right, which had originally been recorded by an artist named Arthur Crudup. But the kid was not playing it like a traditional blues song. He was playing it incredibly fast, with a driving, bouncing, energetic rhythm that was completely unique. He was tapping on the wood of his guitar, creating a beat that made it impossible not to move. Hearing the upbeat noise, the band members ran back into the booth, grabbed their instruments, and began to play along with him, caught up in the pure, unadulterated joy of the sound. Sam stood up in the control room, his ears ringing with this incredible, loud, kinetic music. He ran out of the control room, threw open the door to the recording booth, and what he saw absolutely took his breath away. The shy, quiet truck driver was leaping around the room, totally lost in the rhythm, strumming his guitar with a wild, infectious energy. His voice was pouring out of him with a raw, electric power, a perfect blend of soulful blues and energetic country swing. It was a sound that Sam had never heard in his entire life, a completely new kind of music that defied any existing genre. Sam stood there with goosebumps covering his arms, realizing that this was the exact sound he had been searching for his entire life. He shouted to the band to keep playing exactly what they were playing, quickly turned on the recording equipment, and captured the track on tape that very night. When the song was played on a local Memphis radio station a few days later, the station was completely flooded with phone calls from listeners demanding to hear it again. The young truck driver became a sensation overnight, launching a career that would completely revolutionize the music industry and pop culture forever. The studio was Sun Records, and the young truck driver who spent $4 to record a song for his mother was none other than Elvis Presley, the future king of rock and roll. It is truly mind-blowing to think that the entire history of rock and roll was set in motion because a young man wanted to make a thoughtful birthday gift for his mother. But our third story takes us to a very different kind of arena, where a single, high-stakes decision in a boxing ring completely transformed a man's reputation and paved his way to leading an entire nation. Our story takes place on the evening of March 31st, 2012, in the city of Ottawa, Canada. Inside a massive, brightly lit convention center, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a professional boxing ring. The arena was packed to the brim with hundreds of screaming spectators, and television cameras were swooping overhead, broadcasting the event to thousands of viewers across the country. Justin was incredibly nervous. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, and his hands were sweating inside his heavy boxing gloves. This was easily the most important athletic event of his life, but it was also, terrifyingly, the very first time he had ever stepped into a boxing ring for an actual fight. He was a complete amateur, and he knew that his entire reputation and future were on the line. The match was a highly publicized charity event called the Fight for the Cure, designed to raise funds for cancer research. But there was also a massive political rivalry at play. Justin was a young, ambitious member of parliament, and his opponent was a conservative senator. The fight was viewed by the media as a symbolic battle between two opposing political ideologies and personalities. It was a clash between the progressive, young liberal and the older, traditional conservative. Justin looked across the ring and locked eyes with his opponent. His opponent's name was Brass Knuckles Brazil, although his real name was Patrick Brazeau. He was a highly intimidating figure who had served in the Canadian military and held a black belt in karate. He was notorious for possessing an incredibly strong, bone-shattering punch, which is how he had earned the nickname Brass Knuckles Brazil. He was several pounds heavier than Justin, with broad shoulders and a reputation for raw physical aggression. During the pre-fight weigh-in, the contrast between the two men could not have been more obvious. Brass Knuckles Brazil stood there shirtless, showing off his muscular, tattooed physique, looking like a professional gladiator. Justin, on the other hand, looked lean and relatively average, leading the media and the public to completely write him off before the match even started. Almost everyone who was following the fight believed that Brass Knuckles Brazil was going to absolutely destroy Justin. And it was not just because of his opponent's military background and martial arts skills, but because of Justin's own public reputation. To the Canadian public, Justin was viewed as a soft, pampered, and incredibly privileged intellectual. He was the son of a highly famous former prime minister, and most people believed he had lived a life of luxury, completely insulated from any real physical hardship or conflict. He was seen as a lightweight, a handsome and charming man who lacked any real toughness or grit, often dismissed as a mere drama teacher who had stumbled into politics. The idea of him entering a boxing ring against a military veteran was seen as a joke. When Justin had first entered the ring that night, the sports announcers on television did not even try to hide their skepticism. They openly mocked his appearance, his fancy hair, and his bright red boxing trunks. They immediately gave him the mocking nickname of the Shiny Pony, laughing about how quickly he was going to get knocked out by a tough military veteran like Brass Knuckles Brazil. They predicted that the fight would not even last past the first round. But what the announcers and the public did not know was that the Shiny Pony had been training quietly and intensely for months. He had spent hours in local gyms, sweating, lifting weights, and practicing his punches, determined to prove to the world that he was much tougher than his pampered image suggested. He had learned how to take a punch, how to move his feet, and how to maintain his breathing under intense pressure. The bell rang for the first round, and the fight began. Justin, fueled by pure adrenaline, charged across the ring and immediately started throwing wild, heavy punches. But his technique was chaotic, and Brass Knuckles Brazil easily slipped and ducked away from every single blow. And then the counterattack came. Brass Knuckles Brazil stepped forward and began to pummel Justin with brutal, precise force. He landed heavy, painful punches to Justin's ribs, chest, and face. Justin's head snapped back under the impact of the blows, and he quickly found himself completely overwhelmed, bleeding from his nose and mouth, and desperately clinging to his opponent just to stay upright. The heavy gloves of the military veteran felt like blocks of cement hitting his jaw. The announcers on television were practically laughing, calling the match a complete slaughter and mocking Justin for ever thinking he could step into a ring with a real fighter. They commented that the Shiny Pony was about to be sent to the pasture. Justin was in absolute agony, his vision spinning, and he was on the absolute verge of falling to the canvas. His body wanted to give up, and his brain was telling him to lie down and let the pain stop. But right before Brass Knuckles Brazil could land a decisive knockout punch, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first round. Justin stumbled back to his corner, his legs shaking. The ringside medic immediately rushed in to clean the blood off his face, and his coach leaned in, shouting instructions and trying to get him to focus. But Justin could barely hear a word. His head was throbbing, and he was in deep physical shock. But amid all the pain and the roaring of the crowd, a clear, powerful realization came over him. He knew that if he quit now, or if he allowed himself to get easily knocked out in the second round, his public life would be completely over. He would permanently be branded as a joke, a weak, pampered coward who tried to act tough on national television and got humiliated. He knew that the only way to save his reputation was to fight with absolute, reckless abandon. He had to stop trying to box defensively and simply fight for his life. The bell rang for the second round. Justin stood up, wiped the blood from his eyes, and charged back out into the center of the ring. But this time, his energy was completely different. He was fast, relentless, and completely focused. He went straight at Brass Knuckles Brazil, throwing a rapid barrage of heavy punches. And to the absolute shock of everyone in the arena, his punches began to land. He struck Brass Knuckles Brazil with a series of powerful, stinging blows to the head and body. The military veteran was caught completely off guard, expecting Justin to be timid and defeated after the beating he had taken in the first round. Instead, he was facing a man who seemed completely possessed and utterly unafraid of pain. Justin kept moving forward, landing hit after hit, driving his opponent back against the ropes. He used his height advantage to keep the veteran at a distance, landing jab after jab with incredible accuracy. The crowd in the convention center erupted into a deafening roar. The sports announcers were in complete disbelief, shouting into their microphones as the shiny pony completely dominated the round. By the time the bell rang to end the second round, it was Brass Knuckles Brazil who was stumbling back to his corner, gasping for air and looking completely stunned. During the brief rest period, Justin stood in his corner, his chest heaving. He looked across the ring and saw that his opponent was avoiding his gaze, looking exhausted, defeated, and deeply shaken. Justin knew that he had won the mental battle. The bell rang for the third and final round. Justin did not hesitate for a second. He charged across the canvas and unleashed a brutal, unstoppable attack on Brass Knuckles Brazil, landing powerful punches to his face over and over again. Finally, Justin landed a massive, bone-crushing right hook directly to his opponent's nose. The impact was so severe that the man's nose completely shattered and blood began to pour down his face. The referee immediately stepped in, pushed Justin back, and stopped the fight. It was a technical knockout victory. The shiny pony had won the match. The arena went absolutely wild, and the victory became the single biggest news story in Canada the next day. While the fight was officially just a charity event to raise money, the true significance of the match was deeply political. Justin had taken a massive, incredibly risky gamble to completely redefine how the entire nation viewed him. By stepping into the ring against a highly formidable opponent, taking a brutal beating, and fighting his way to a dominant victory through sheer grit and determination, he completely shattered his image as a soft, pampered intellectual. The public now saw him as a tough, resilient, and charismatic fighter who was capable of standing his ground and overcoming impossible odds. They realized that he had played a brilliant strategic game, intentionally letting his opponent wear himself out in the first round before launching his own offensive. Justin used this incredible surge of national popularity and respect to launch a massive political campaign, eventually leading his party to a historic victory and getting elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. His full name is Justin Trudeau, and his opponent in that legendary match was Patrick Brazeau, referred to during the broadcast as Brass Knuckles Brazil. It all started because a man, nicknamed the Shiny Pony, decided to step into a boxing ring to prove to his country that he was a fighter. These three stories, as different as they are, all share a powerful and inspiring truth. They show us that our lives are not completely defined by our current circumstances, no matter how difficult, painful, or hopeless they might seem. A broke writer sitting in a quiet cafe with debt collectors calling his phone, a young truck driver who was far too shy to make eye contact with a stranger, and a politician openly mocked by his entire country as a pampered, weak, lightweight. None of them could have predicted where their simple choices would lead them on that day. but by choosing to take a chance, to step out of their comfort zones, and to push forward through the rejection, the physical pain, and the overwhelming doubt, they completely rewrote their destinies. Their decisions did not just change their own lives, they created iconic art, revolutionary music, and political history that will endure for generations to come. It is a powerful reminder that the smallest, most routine choices we make today might just be the very first step on a massive journey that changes everything. We should never underestimate the power of a single moment or a single decision to transform our world forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Every year, people disappear in the forests of North America under circumstances so strange that even experienced investigators struggle to explain them. Some vanish within seconds while standing only a few feet away from family members. Others are later found miles away in places they should never have been able to reach on their own. And some are never found at all. In many of these cases, there are no tracks, no signs of struggle, and no evidence pointing to what actually happened. Just impossible timelines, bizarre details, and witnesses left with the overwhelming feeling that something deeply wrong occurred in those woods. Tonight, we're looking at 3 real cases that continue to disturb investigators decades later. Cases involving missing children, unexplained movements through dangerous terrain, strange animal behavior, and one discovery so unsettling that even the man who found it believed something had led him there. The first case happened in Maryland in 1941. On the 21st of May 1941, a young mother named Betty Albright was feeling the kind of exhaustion that only parents of a toddler can truly understand. Her son, 3-year-old Eldridge, was a bundle of endless energy, and Betty just needed a moment to herself, a moment to recharge. So, she came up with a simple plan. She packed up her son and drove to her own mother's house in the quiet, rural area of Woodstock, Maryland. The plan was for her mother, Eldridge's granny, to watch him for the afternoon so Betty could get some much-needed sleep. They pulled up to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon. Betty went inside, gave her son a kiss, handed him over to her mom, and went straight upstairs to a quiet bedroom to lie down. For little Eldridge, a trip to his granny's house was a huge adventure. Her backyard was a paradise for a 3-year-old boy. If you stood on her back porch, you'd be looking out at a massive, open, grassy area about 250 meters of pure running room. This huge lawn ran all the way up to the edge of a dense, dark forest. And right in the middle of the property, directly in line with the back porch, there was a small 3-meter gap in the tree line. If you walked through that gap, it led you down into a shallow creek bed. Now, this creek was seasonal, meaning most of the time it was completely dry, just a sandy, rocky ditch. This was important because from the back porch, anyone standing in that creek bed, right in that gap, was in perfect, clear view. So, the rule was simple. Eldridge was allowed to play down there, but he couldn't go left or right, which would take him out of sight. So on this particular day, Eldridge and his grandmother stepped out onto the back porch. As soon as his feet hit the wooden planks, Eldridge was off. He spotted the gap in the trees and made a beeline for it, running across the huge yard with his grandmother's 3 dogs happily chasing after him. His grandmother watched him go, a smile on her face. She was getting on in years and just didn't have the energy to make the long walk all the way down to the creek bed herself. So she decided she'd just sit on the porch, keep a close eye on Eldridge, and maybe read a bit from a book she had. She watched her grandson, a tiny figure in the distance, reach the break in the trees and then hop down into the dry creek bed. She could see him clearly, goofing around with the dogs, picking up little rocks and throwing them, just having the time of his life. For the next 5 or 10 minutes, she just sat there, watching him play, feeling content and at ease. At some point, she picked up the book she'd set next to her chair and started to read. She'd read a few lines, then look up, check on Eldridge, see him still playing right where he was supposed to be, and then look back down at her book. It was a peaceful, ordinary afternoon. At about 2 o'clock, she was looking down at her book when she heard her grandson's voice cut through the quiet air. He yelled out for help. Now, any parent or grandparent knows that 3-year-olds can yell for help for any number of reasons. Maybe they dropped a toy, or maybe they saw a funny-looking bug. It's not always a real emergency, but it's the tone of their voice that tells you everything. And the grandmother would later say that the way Eldridge yelled, it sounded like a real emergency. It had a sharp edge of panic to it. Immediately, she looked up from her book. Just a minute before, she had seen him playing in the creek bed, right in that gap in the trees. But now, when she looked, he was gone. And so were the dogs. The space was completely empty. A jolt of alarm went through her. She jumped out of her seat, hurried down the porch steps, and started walking quickly across the yard, calling his name. She was about halfway across the huge lawn when she heard it again. Eldridge yelled for help a second time. But this time, his voice was different. It sounded much farther away, as if it was coming from deep inside the forest, far from where she had last heard him. It gave her the chilling impression that he had moved a great distance in just a matter of moments. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Her heart started pounding in her chest. The feeling triggered a primal fear inside of her, and she broke into a full run, sprinting towards the creek bed. She was scanning the tree line, but there was still no sign of Eldridge, no sign of any of the dogs. She was getting close now, maybe 10 meters away from the break in the trees, when she heard her grandson's voice for a third and final time. It was so faint this time, barely audible, coming from way, way off in the woods. He cried out for help, but as he was yelling, the sound was suddenly cut off, as if someone had clamped a hand over his mouth mid-yell. It was a stifled, choked-off sound that made her blood run cold. She burst through the gap in the trees and scrambled down into the creek bed. She stopped and looked out in front of her. Nothing. Just the dense, silent forest. She spun to her right, looking down the creek bed. Nothing. Then she looked to her left. And that's when she saw one of her dogs. It was standing about 10 meters away, frozen in place, its back facing her. The dog was positioned in a way that it was clearly staring intently at something deeper in the woods. Thinking it must have found Eldridge, she ran down to the dog. But when she got there, she saw there was nothing beyond it. No little boy, no other dogs. The dog itself was just rooted to the spot. Its hair was standing on end, and a low, menacing growl was coming from its throat. It kept taking these tiny, hesitant steps backward, as if it was terrified of whatever it was looking at. The grandmother looked up, trying to see what the dog was so focused on, but she couldn't see anything at all. It was just the forest. At that moment, she felt a sickening certainty wash over her. Someone had taken Eldridge. Someone had abducted him right out of the creek bed. She turned and tried to pull the dog back with her to get it to come to the house, but the dog wouldn't budge. It was completely fixated. So she left it there and ran as fast as she could back to the house to wake up Betty. The two of them, panicked and frantic, came running back down to the creek bed. The dog was still there in the exact same spot, still growling, still staring in the same direction, as if whatever it was seeing hadn't moved an inch. They yelled Eldridge's name for a few more minutes, their voices swallowed by the woods. The grandmother told her daughter, "I think he's been taken. We have to call the police." Finally, Betty agreed. They managed to coax the terrified dog away from its spot, and they all ran back to the house and called the authorities. Not long after, the state police showed up, and they arrived with a huge group of searchers. They went straight down to the creek bed, where the grandmother pointed them in the direction the dog had been staring, to the left. It was also the same direction she had heard Eldridge's cries coming from. Very quickly, the police made a discovery. About 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed, they found some of Eldridge's footprints in a patch of soft sand at the edge of the creek. The prints showed him walking away from the area he was supposed to stay in. But here's where it got strange. The footprints showed him walking for maybe 20 or 30 meters, and then, inexplicably, the prints just stopped. They just ended, right there in the middle of the sand. It wasn't like he had stepped onto grass or rocks. If he had gone forward, backward, left, or right, he would have left more prints in the sand. But there were none. It was as if he had been lifted straight up into the air. This immediately made police think of a kidnapping. This must have been the spot where someone picked him up. But they scoured the area and found no other footprints. No sign of an adult, no sign of a struggle. For the rest of that day, and all through the night, they found nothing else. No more signs of Eldridge, and no sign of the other two missing dogs. The next day, about 24 hours after Eldridge had gone missing, the search had expanded significantly. A number of search crews had gone well outside the primary search area. Their hope was that they might at least find one of the two lost dogs, thinking maybe a dog could lead them to the child. One of these crews was 4 miles away from the grandmother's house. They were walking past a swampy, marshy area when one of the searchers stopped. He thought he heard something. It sounded like a child whimpering, and it was coming from inside the swamp. Immediately, the whole crew turned and started wading into the swamp through the fairly deep, murky water. They pushed through the thick undergrowth and came to a small clearing. In the clearing, they saw a rocky overhang with tall grass growing all around it, almost forming a little cave. The whimpering sound was coming from underneath that rock. They rushed over, pulling the tall grass aside, and sure enough, tucked away in this makeshift cave was little Eldridge. He was lying on a perfectly constructed bed of leaves. It looked exactly like an animal's den. It was so well made that either Eldridge had stumbled upon an animal's den and crawled inside, or he had somehow built this beautiful, intricate bed of leaves himself. When they found him, he was fast asleep, and the whimpering sound was something he was making in his sleep. As they got closer, he slowly woke up. He sat up, looking very groggy and confused. All of his clothes were torn and tattered, and he wasn't wearing any shoes. But other than that, he seemed to be okay. He was just very, very confused. The searchers scooped him up and carried him all the way back to the search headquarters. He was reunited with his mother and his grandmother, and everyone was just overcome with relief that he was alive. But at the same time, everyone was thinking the same thing. How on earth did a 3-year-old get 4 miles away in the middle of a swamp all by himself? After a doctor checked him over and confirmed he was fine, aside from some scratches and bruises, the police sat down with Eldridge, along with his mother and grandmother, and they gently tried to ask him what had happened. But it was no use. Eldridge seemed to have no idea that anything had happened at all. He didn't even seem to know he had been gone for 24 hours, lost in the woods. It was as if the entire event had been completely erased from his memory, like a total blackout. Because Eldridge was found alive and basically unharmed, the police didn't continue to investigate the case. And so, we're left with so many questions. We don't know what caused him to suddenly start yelling for help, his voice drifting farther and farther into the woods. We don't know what that dog saw in the creek bed that terrified it so much it refused to move. And we still don't know how a 3-year-old boy could have traveled 4 miles through dense forest and multiple swamps only to end up sleeping in a perfect den in another swamp. The police officially said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, but pretty much everyone else involved in the case believes someone or something took him that day. He was just one of the very lucky ones who was found alive. Unfortunately, there was never any clarification on what happened to the other 2 dogs. The way the story is told, it seems they were never found. In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, a tiny town with fewer than 1,000 people. Their house was situated on a very quiet street with very few neighbors nearby. Their property backed right up against a dense forest, which was essentially their backyard. Their daughter, a 2-year-old girl named Anna, loved to play in the yard. But she had a strict rule she had to follow. She had to stay on the grassy part of the backyard and was absolutely forbidden from going into the forest. This was because the woods were known to be infested with snakes, and Anna was absolutely terrified of them. So she was more than happy to stay on the grass where it was safe. On the 5th of May, 1950, Anna was playing in that grassy section of her backyard. Her mother was inside, in the kitchen, but she was watching her daughter through the back window. For just a moment, her mother looked down to attend to something on the stove. And in that split second, she heard her daughter let out a piercing scream. She looked back up, and Anna was gone. The yard was empty. She immediately bolted out the back door, yelling for her daughter, her eyes scanning the entire yard. Anna was nowhere in sight. Her mother knew with a sinking feeling that she must have gone into the forest. And her first thought was a snake. She must have been bitten by a snake, and now she's lying on the ground somewhere, hurt, and that's why I can't see her. So she ran into the forest, screaming Anna's name over and over, her voice cracking with panic. But she got no response. The woods were silent. She was starting to panic, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. All of her yelling got the attention of her 2 older sons who were inside the house. They came running outside to see what was wrong, and they immediately joined the search, fanning out into the woods, calling for their little sister. But she was just gone. After only a few minutes of this frantic searching, Anna's mother realized they needed help. She ran back inside and called the police. When the police showed up, they launched a massive search. And in a small town like Dunbar, word travels fast. The news that a child had gone missing spread like wildfire, and soon it seemed like virtually everyone in the town had shown up to help. They formed search parties and combed through the entire forest behind the Thorpe's property, looking under every bush, behind every tree. But there was just no sign of Anna. After the first 24 hours had passed without a single clue, the search organizers made a decision. They needed to expand the search area. They went from a 1-mile radius around the house to a 3-mile radius, and it was a good thing they did. Within just a few hours of making that change, a search crew that was 3 full miles away from where Anna had gone missing found her. And she was alive. She was lying underneath a blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. And right next to her on the ground was a neat little pile of her clothes. When the searchers approached her, she seemed to be completely okay. They gently picked her up and carried her all the way back to the search headquarters, where she was finally reunited with her parents. A doctor examined her and was stunned. He said there were no signs that she had been attacked. In fact, there were no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. No cuts, no scratches, no bruises. The doctor said it didn't even look like she had been outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what had happened to her, she couldn't give any meaningful answers. She was only 2 years old, after all. But the reason this case is so baffling, the reason it stands out, is not just because she vanished from her own backyard and was found 3 miles away. It's because of where she was found. For her to have been in that exact spot under that blackberry bush, the only way, the absolute only way for her to have gotten there was if she had crossed 10 separate barbed wire fences. There was no other path, no road, no trail. Any other route would have been a massive detour that an adult would have struggled to cover in that amount of time, let alone a 2-year-old. So here you have this little girl found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences without a single scratch on her body. It's just not possible. Think about it. Even if you take the sharp barbs off the fence, a 2-year-old trying to climb a large fence is a huge task in itself. But to do it 10 times, and to do it without getting a single scrape or tear in your skin, It's truly impossible. An article in the LA Times from May 7th said the police were completely baffled by this 10-fence dilemma. They stated that the only way it could possibly make sense is if she had been abducted by someone, carried over the fences, and then dumped there. But in the same breath, the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence at all to suggest she had been abducted, attacked, or harmed in any way. It was a complete contradiction. The location where she was found simply did not add up with her physical condition. Ultimately, the police had to release an official statement. They concluded that it must have been an accident, that 2-year-old Anna had somehow, against all odds, managed to just walk her way past all these fences and was found where she was. And that everyone should just be thankful that she was alive. But there was an interesting detail. The police confiscated her clothing, the little pile they found next to her, and they refused to give it back to her parents. This strongly indicated that they were continuing to investigate even though the child had been found. But unfortunately, the police never revealed if they ever discovered anything else about this case. And just like in the Eldridge case, Anna's parents were so relieved to have their daughter back alive and unharmed that they didn't press the authorities for more information. Now, Anna's case might seem like some bizarre one-in-a-million anomaly, but this was not the first time something like this had happened in this small area of Pennsylvania. Just 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old named Ronald Collier also vanished in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which also overlooked that same forest. At some point, his mother went inside for a moment, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the porch chairs. She estimated that she was inside for maybe 10 or 15 seconds at the most. When she came back out, Ronald was gone. The police and the community once again came out in force. They combed through the woods, but they couldn't find any sign of Ronald. In this case, the police became very frustrated with Ronald's parents. They felt like the timeline just didn't make sense. How could a child completely disappear without a trace in just 15 seconds? They started to suspect that the parents must have had something to do with it. So the police made Ronald's parents take polygraph tests. Both of his parents passed every single one. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but tragically, it was eventually called off. They never found him. Many people in the area believed that someone or something, like a bear or another large animal, had been lurking in the tree line, watching Ronald. And as soon as his mother went inside, it ran up, snatched the child, and disappeared back into the woods with him. The police, however, said there was no evidence to back up a kidnapping or an animal attack. They claimed it was far more likely that Ronald just got up and walked away on his own and got lost. But then, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, the similarities were just too striking for the locals to ignore. People started saying that it looked like Anna had been abducted and then placed where she was eventually found. And so, it was probably the same person or the same thing that took Ronald. Anna was just lucky enough to have been let go. Now, this theory of a mystery predator is just that, a theory. But it does seem a lot more plausible than a 2-year-old boy getting up and running into oblivion in 15 seconds, never to be seen again. And it seems more plausible than a 2-year-old girl scaling 10 barbed wire fences in 24 hours without getting a single scratch on her body. Unfortunately, though, we'll probably never know the truth. In September of 2004, a 49-year-old man named Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming. They were headed for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana for a hunting trip. Their plan was to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe. Robert and his family were members of the Crow tribe, so they had the right to hunt on that land. The specific spot they were going to be hunting in was called Black Canyon, a particularly steep, rugged, and challenging area. But Robert was more than equipped to handle this kind of environment. He had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their elite special operations unit. This meant he had received a very high level of outdoor survival training. He was perfectly suited for living and operating in the mountains. And Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from their father. They were very competent and experienced outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reservation on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan for the day was this. The two boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon. They would then try to drive any elk they found down into the valley where their dad would be waiting to take a shot at them. But as the day went on, late into the afternoon, the two teenage boys hadn't seen a single elk. The sun was starting to get low in the sky, and they knew it was time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot. So they packed up their gear and started walking. The boys made it back to the meeting area, but their father Robert wasn't there. So they sat down on some rocks and began to wait. An hour went by. Then 2 hours. Then 3. Still, there was no sign of their dad. They had no way to get in touch with him. There was no cell phone service this deep in the mountains. They started to think through the possibilities. Okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around somehow and lost his bearings. He'll have to spend the night out in the cold. But he was wearing warm winter clothes, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew how to build a shelter, how to find water. He would be fine. But as the sun finally set and darkness began to fall, the boys knew they had to make a decision. They finally left the meeting spot to go and tell the authorities that their dad was lost somewhere in Black Canyon. But even then, it wasn't really registering for them that this could be a life-threatening situation. To them, their dad was a Superman figure. He was invincible. The idea that something really bad could have happened to him just didn't cross their minds. Authorities launched a search that very night. This included using helicopters equipped with thermal imagers, which did low flyovers of the entire Black Canyon area. Thermal imagers work by picking up heat signatures. Any living person gives off a heat signature, so at night, if you were flying over a canyon where there's virtually nothing else around, a person would stand out like a bright shining light. But that night, the helicopters flew back and forth over Black Canyon, and their thermal imagers never picked up anything that looked like Robert. The authorities weren't too worried yet. They said, this guy is a trained former special operator. He probably went and found shelter for the night. He could be inside a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter out of tree branches, and it's obscuring him from the thermal imager. We'll just have to look for him on the ground tomorrow. But the next day came and went with no sign of him. Despite bringing out hundreds of searchers, bloodhounds, people on horseback, and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was absolutely no sign of Robert. After several weeks of this intensive searching with no clues, no tracks, no sign of him at all, they ultimately had to call it off. The family was obviously crushed. But more than that, they were just completely dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to the invincible Robert Springfield, it just didn't add up for them. So after the official search was terminated, they continued to make their own trips into Black Canyon, looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, just like all the professional searchers, they never found any trace of him. And eventually, they had to accept that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter was in Black Canyon. He didn't know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared in this same area. This hunter was walking through a really dense section of the forest. He was all alone, an experienced hunter, and he wasn't following any path. He was just kind of kaying his way through the woods. And he started to hear what sounded like a crow screeching. At first, it didn't really register with him. It was just a normal sound of the forest. It was only later, in retrospect, that he recalled this strange sequence of events. As he kept walking, the screeching got louder and more intense, to the point where he just couldn't ignore it anymore. It was insistent. So he stopped walking and turned to listen to this screeching crow, which he still couldn't see through the dense trees. But he could tell it was coming from a general direction off to his side. This hunter would later say that as soon as he stopped and turned and began to actively listen to this crow, he had a very weird sensation. He felt like the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange, unsettling experience. He'd never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he had spent a lot of time outdoors. He felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow. So he started walking towards the sound of it. He still couldn't see it. The vegetation was just too thick. He was getting closer and closer, and he finally got to a place where he could just barely see the crow. It was in a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a large, broken tree stump. It wasn't short, it was maybe 6, 7, or 8 feet high. It looked like a big tree had broken in the middle and fallen over. And this crow was sitting right on top of this gnarled stump, and it was just incessantly screeching. From his position, the hunter could see the crow, and he was kind of just staring at it, trying to figure out what was going on. As the hunter was looking at the crow suddenly stopped screeching, turned its head, and looked directly at the hunter. It was as if it recognized that the hunter could now see it. And it just sat there, in complete silence, staring directly at the hunter. The hunter would say he felt so unsettled by this sudden change in the crow's behavior. It was almost like it was confirming his weird feeling that the crow had been looking for him, and now that it had found him, it had stopped calling. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter, to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the thick vegetation and into the clearing to kind of confront the bird. So he stepped out into the clearing. The whole time, the crow wasn't making a sound, just watching him. The hunter stood there in the clearing, and he looked up at the crow on the stump. And the crow suddenly looked straight down. The hunter followed the crow's gaze down to the ground at the base of the tree. And there he saw a human skull. The hunter was so taken aback by this, so shocked, that he looked back up at the crow, who was now looking at him again. The whole situation was so bizarre and terrifying to this hunter that he just made a mental note of where he was, turned around, and ran. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in an area with cell phone reception, he called the authorities. The authorities showed up, and he showed them on a map where he had discovered the crow and the skull next to the tree. And sure enough, the authorities made their way out to that spot, and they found the skull right there under the tree. The crow, at this point, was gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it wasn't just a human skull. There was also a human femur bone lying right next to the skull. And then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed neatly right next to one another. And then next to the boots was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to them. And next to that was a jacket that wasn't folded but was balled up. And inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that immediate area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately, they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected. They eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. But then they later recanted that statement and said that actually he was hit by a falling tree. But that theory makes no sense. If he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't his body have been in that area? And why were all of his things so neatly stacked? He certainly wouldn't have done that after getting hit by a tree. So who neatly stacked his things? And where are his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons probably would have heard the struggle. They were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? And here's the biggest question of all. The location where Robert's remains were found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. So it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid. This means that if he had been under that tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking for him. The fact that he wasn't found means one of two things. Either hundreds of people, dogs, and a helicopter with a thermal imager all missed him. Or he wasn't there until after the search was terminated. And if that's the case, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by the hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to that tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe the hunter's story, and many people do, then do you really think it's just a coincidence that all of this took place on the Crow Reservation, the home of the Crow tribe? It seems unlikely. But we'll probably never know the truth about what actually happened to Robert Springfield. The forests in these stories are still there, quiet, unchanged. And whatever caused these disappearances may still be out there too. Until next time. Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have 3 stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there, holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else. Something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact, the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, "He said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back." "But Don, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out." Don was just as confused as she was. He said, "All right, that's weird." He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Don was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, "Go over it again." What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, "I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back. I just don't understand it." They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Don, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Don asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Don that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Don had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luoan village. Luoan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma Qingmao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luoan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but two enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town, and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Ma Qingmao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Ma Qingmao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Ma Qingmao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Ma Qingmao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Ma Qingmao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luoan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. And what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luoan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Ma Fuxing was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Ma Fuxing collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Ma Fuxing had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Ma Fuxing. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luoan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Malene. Malene was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Malene's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Malene were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. But he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding onto an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Ballen. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Ballen in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Ballen to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Ballen couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Ballen quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Ballen suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows, It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time. On the morning of the 23rd of July 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus was standing in Riverside Park in a town called Chester-le-Street in England. And he was not happy. He paced back and forth on the grass, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the massive, brightly colored structure that was supposed to be his masterpiece. This was supposed to be one of the biggest, most important days of his entire 40-year career. But right now, things were going wrong. The exhibit was called Dreamspace, and it was enormous. Imagine something about half the size of a soccer field made of translucent, colored plastic, all inflated to create a sprawling network of interconnected tunnels and domes. The whole idea was for people to walk through it, to get lost in this world of color and light and sound. Maurice had designed it so that visitors could wander from a red room to a blue room to a yellow room, and the changing colors, combined with soft ambient music piped throughout the structure, would create an immersive, almost meditative experience. It was art you could walk into and live inside, if only for a little while. And this was by far the biggest and most ambitious physical exhibit Maurice had ever attempted. It had taken months of planning, a huge amount of money, and a dedicated team to get it built and transported here. Naturally, there had been some issues along the way, some construction hiccups and logistical headaches, but Maurice was sure it would all be worth it. He knew that placing it right in the middle of a popular public park on a summer weekend meant it was going to be seen by a lot of people. This was his chance to bring his art to the masses, to give them an experience they would never forget. But before they could officially open the doors to the public, there was still one more hiccup to deal with, and it was a big one. When Maurice had arrived at the park early that morning, ready for the grand opening, he'd done a final inspection. And his heart sank. He realized that part of his exhibit hadn't been set up correctly. Some sections weren't fully inflated, and more importantly, the anchoring system, the network of ropes and pegs that held the massive inflatable to the ground, wasn't complete. He and his staff immediately got to work, rushing around to fix everything. They had to re-inflate certain chambers, adjust the tension on some of the ropes, and add some finishing touches to the exterior to make it look perfect. Maurice was a perfectionist, and he couldn't stand the thought of people seeing his masterpiece in a state that was anything less than flawless. But as he worked, he could feel the pressure mounting. He knew they really, really needed to hurry. Making all these last-minute changes was eating up precious time. They were supposed to open at 10 a.m., and it was already well past that. And Maurice could see with his own eyes the consequences of the delay. A queue was forming at the entrance. People who had already bought tickets online, families with their kids, couples on a day out, they were all lining up, looking at the closed entrance with confusion and a growing sense of annoyance. Maurice could just imagine what they were thinking. What was the holdup? Why weren't they being let inside? And a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He was terrified that if he didn't get this thing open soon, people would just give up. They'd ask for refunds, they'd walk away, and they would never get to see how amazing his masterpiece truly was. After all his work, all his passion, the thought of it being a failure before it even opened was just devastating. So, at a certain point, Maurice just had to make a call. He stepped back and took a long look at what he and his staff had managed to fix so far. Things were looking better. They had addressed the most obvious cosmetic issues. The structure looked full and inviting. And even though, as a perfectionist, he would have loved to spend another hour or two tweaking things and making absolutely sure every single safety protocol was double and triple checked, he decided that getting Dreamspace open right now was far more important. It was good enough. So he turned to his staff, who were still working on securing some of the anchors at the back of the structure, and told them to stop what they were doing. He instructed them to go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. The masterpiece was finally open for business. A few hours later, around 3:15 inches the afternoon, a 68-year-old woman named Elizabeth Collings walked into that same park. She was with her 14-year-old grandson, and they were just out for a casual stroll. They lived nearby, and it was just the perfect day for it. It was sunny and warm, but a light breeze was blowing, keeping things from getting too hot. Elizabeth was enjoying the simple pleasure of the moment, the wind in her hair, her grandson happily walking beside her. She felt completely at peace. But then her grandson stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed and said, "Hey, look at that!" Elizabeth turned to see what had caught his eye. And there, on the other side of the park, she saw it. This sprawling, vibrant, colorful structure with a huge line of people still waiting to get in, and this soothing, dreamy music drifting out from its open doors. Elizabeth had never seen anything like it. It looked magical, almost like something from another world had landed in the middle of their local park. She thought whatever it was, it looked incredibly intriguing. Her grandson was already excited, practically pulling on her arm to go check it out, and Elizabeth felt a little thrill of excitement herself. "All right," she said with a smile. "Let's go." A few minutes later, Elizabeth and her grandson had bought their tickets and stepped inside the exhibit. And instantly, Elizabeth knew they had made a great decision. The light inside was dim and filtered through the colored plastic walls, making it seem like they were walking through a rainbow. The dreamy, tranquil music surrounded them, and even though it was fairly crowded and a bit warm inside, it still felt remarkably peaceful. Elizabeth could feel the tension in her shoulders just melt away. Her entire body seemed to relax. For the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered slowly from one chamber to the next, taking in the atmosphere, the lights, and the music. They moved from a deep red room into a bright yellow one, and then into a room that was a beautiful, calming shade of blue. There was some light coming in from an adjacent room, which was a sort of brownish orange color, and when the light from that room mixed with the blue of the room they were in, it had this strange, beautiful effect of making the whole space feel like it was a deep, ethereal green. It was, just as the artist intended, a very cool, serene experience. Both Elizabeth and her grandson were completely transfixed, just standing there quietly taking it all in, and it was in that moment, as they stood together in that peaceful blue-green world, that they heard it. A deafening snapping sound, loud and sharp like a giant whip cracking right next to their ears. The moment the sound hit, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. As she stared at the colors around her, the whole room seemed to tilt sideways. She stumbled a few steps, trying to regain her balance, feeling like the floor was moving beneath her feet. At first, she wondered if maybe the heat and the strange lights were just getting to her, making her feel faint. But then she was overcome by an almost floating sensation, a feeling of impossible lightness, as if the room itself was pulling away from the ground. And then she had the terrifying realization that her feet were no longer touching the floor. Outside, Maurice Agis, the creator of Dreamspace, was mingling with the guests who were still in line. And from his perspective, the day had turned into a huge success. After the stressful morning, everything was going great. He had managed to get the last-minute fixes done just in time, and now hundreds of people had come to see his work. There were still at least 40 or 50 people in the queue, with more joining all the time. And best of all, every single person who came out of the exhibit was beaming. They were telling their friends what an incredible, amazing experience it was. The day had been saved. Maurice was filled with a sense of pride and relief. It was all going perfectly. Until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud crack echoed across the park, everyone heard it. Maurice was looking away from Dreamspace at that moment, talking to a visitor. But then he heard screams coming from behind him. He whipped around, and his brain couldn't immediately process what he was seeing. All he saw were these dark shapes just falling out of the clear blue sky, one after another, smashing into the ground with sickening thuds. For a split second, Maurice and everyone else around him were just frozen, trying to understand what these falling objects were. And then, with a wave of absolute horror, Maurice realized what he was looking at. Those shapes were people. So, let's go back to that morning, to that frantic rush to get the exhibit open. Maurice knew this was probably going to be his last big art exhibit. At 74, this was his grand finale, the exclamation point on a long and storied career. He was so worried, so completely terrified, that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, the waiting crowd would leave, the day would be a failure, and his masterpiece would be remembered as a flop. And so, in his panic, he made a catastrophic decision. He essentially stopped his staff from finishing all the necessary work, overriding their process in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he rationalized it to himself, and probably to his staff, was that he was just being a perfectionist. He told himself that he would have times liked, times to have done all the fixes, but that he had done times enough. He told himself it was good enough, and that was all that mattered. But the problem was, it wasn't good enough. Some of the things he overlooked, the things his staff were in the middle of doing when he told them to stop, were not just cosmetic touches. They were vital safety precautions. The most critical of these missed safety steps involved tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the massive exhibit securely to the ground. The staff, following standard procedure, had already tied down the front of the structure, the part that was most visible to the public and the entrance. But because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they hadn't finished anchoring the back of the exhibit. They had the ropes, they had the heavy-duty pegs, but they were told to leave them and go man the entrance instead. This would turn out to be a fatal oversight. You see, Dreamspace was not a regular, permanent building. It wasn't made of brick and concrete with a real foundation. It was, in essence, a gigantic, intricately designed, bouncy castle. It was an inflatable structure made of thin sheets of PVC plastic, the same kind of material shower curtains are made of. And even though it was a beautiful, calm day with just a light breeze blowing through the park, that was all it took. A sudden gust of wind, nothing out of the ordinary for the area, swept across the park and hit the unanchored back wall of the Dreamspace structure. Because the back wasn't tied down, the wind got underneath it and acted like a giant sail. The entire half a soccer field-sized structure was lifted violently into the air. The few anchors at the front, which were never designed to hold the full force of the structure on their own, snapped instantly. That was the deafening cracking sound that everyone heard. And so, in a heartbeat, this place of serenity turned into a giant, uncontrollable hot air balloon. Everyone inside, dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were suddenly and violently thrown around as they were lifted 30 feet into the air. They were all trapped inside this twisting, contorting plastic bubble with no way to get out and no way to control it. As the wind picked up and pushed the structure higher and higher, the violent movements began to tear the plastic seams apart. The structure, as it writhed in the air, began to literally eject the people who were trapped inside of it. They were spit out of the torn holes and fell from a height of 30, 40, even 50 feet, crashing down onto the hard ground below. And that is why, when Maurice turned around, he saw all those people falling from the sky. The scene on the ground was one of absolute chaos and horror. People were screaming. The once peaceful park lawn was now littered with the injured and the dying. First responders rushed to the scene, but it was a nightmare. In the end, 27 people were seriously injured. Many suffered broken bones, head injuries, and severe trauma. And 2 people were killed. One was a 38-year-old radiographer named Claire Firmage. The other was 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings. Her grandson, who had been standing right beside her, survived the fall but was severely injured and had to witness his grandmother's final moments. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. It was led by the UK's Health and Safety Executive, or HSE. When their investigators arrived, the deflated remains of Dreamspace lay like a dead creature on the grass. The first thing they did was walk the perimeter of where the structure had been, and it didn't take them long to find the flaw. They immediately noticed the series of heavy-duty anchor points at the back of the site that had no ropes attached to them. They saw the giant metal pegs, designed to be hammered deep into the earth, lying unused on the grass. It was the smoking gun. This wasn't an act of God, it was a failure of procedure. Next, they interviewed the members of Maurice Augus's staff. And one by one, the distraught crew members told the same story. They confirmed that they had been in the process of securing all the tethers that morning. They told the investigators that they were fully aware that all the anchor points needed to be used, especially on a structure of that size. But they all said they were told to stop by Maurice himself. They recounted how he was stressed, how he was panicked about the growing queue and the delay in opening. They admitted they were instructed to leave the back anchors unsecured and to prioritize getting the doors open for the paying public. Some of the staff members even said they had felt uneasy about it at the time, but he was the artist, he was the boss, and they did what they were told. Investigators also pulled the meteorological reports for that day, and what they found made the situation even more tragic. While it had seemed like a beautiful, calm day to the average person in the park, the official weather forecast had included a warning. It specifically mentioned the possibility of sudden strong gusts of wind for that afternoon. It was a predictable weather event, not a freak tornado that came out of nowhere. Anyone responsible for securing a structure the size of a small building should have been aware of that forecast and taken extra precautions. Instead, the person in charge had taken fewer. So, the investigators were able to reconstruct exactly what happened. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a chain of decisions that led directly to disaster. Maurice Aegis, driven by his artistic ego and the financial pressure of his big day, made the conscious choice to cut corners on safety. He saw the waiting crowd and feared failure more than he feared the potential consequences of his haste. He willfully ignored the concerns of his own staff and, likely, the weather warnings for the day. That predictable gust of wind came, and it hit the structure at its weakest point, the unanchored rear wall. The force was immense, far too much for the few tethers at the front to handle. They snapped, and Dreamspace was launched. The chaos that followed, the fall, the injuries, the deaths of Claire Firmage and Elizabeth Collings, all of it was the direct result of that one decision made hours earlier, the decision that it was good enough. Maurice Aegis was arrested and eventually charged with gross negligence manslaughter for the two deaths. The case went to trial, and it was complex. The prosecution laid out all the evidence found by the HSE. They argued that Aegis, as the creator and operator of the exhibit, had a clear duty of care to his visitors, and that he had failed in that duty in the most catastrophic way possible. They portrayed him as a man who put his pride and his profits ahead of people's lives. But his defense team argued that this was simply a tragic accident. They painted Maurice as a passionate artist, not a safety engineer. They claimed he had relied on his team to handle the technical aspects and that he couldn't have possibly foreseen the terrible consequences of a light breeze. The first trial ended with a hung jury. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision. So, a second trial was held. And this time, the jury came back with a verdict. They found Maurice Aegis not guilty of manslaughter. There was an audible gasp in the courtroom from the families of the victims. However, the jury did find him guilty of a lesser charge, a serious health and safety violation. For a breach that led to 2 deaths and dozens of injuries, his punishment was a fine of £10,000. This was later reduced to just £2,500 on appeal after his lawyers argued that he was an elderly man with no savings. For the families of Elizabeth Collings and Claire Firmage, the verdict was an insult. It felt like there had been no real justice for their loved ones. But despite the light legal punishment, what happened that day completely destroyed Maurice Aegis. He may have avoided a prison sentence, but he was a broken man. The public backlash was immense, and his reputation as an artist was left in ruins. But more than that, he was haunted by the knowledge that his creation, his beautiful dream space that was meant to bring people peace and joy, had instead brought them terror and death. He was so devastated by the destruction his masterpiece had caused that he never made anything like it again. He retreated from the art world entirely. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. In the end, 2 families were left with an empty space that could never be filled. A day that began with the simple, happy decision to take a walk in the park ended in an unimaginable and completely avoidable tragedy. It all came down to a few unused ropes and pegs lying on the grass and a man who, in a moment of pressure, decided that the show must go on, no matter the cost. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. A chilly and rainy evening in late January of 1965 marks the beginning of the story. In the Lebanonian village of Antelias, which is located just a short distance to the north of Beirut, we are situated on a stretch of shoreline. Furthermore, for a young police officer by the name of Fareed Jabber, this evening was about to bring about a sea change in his life. Everything about the weather was terrible. The sand on the beach was transformed into a chilly, dark slush as a result of the continuous and freezing rain that was blowing down. In addition to the deep darkness that was pressing in from all directions, the wind howled in from the sea. The kind of night that would have been ideal for sensible people to be at home, tucked away in their cozy beds. Furthermore, Farid fervently wanted that he was one of its members. While he was out here, strolling along the beach with his companion, he had his jacket drawn over him, but it wasn't doing anything to help him. The chilly air had already penetrated his bones to a great extent. However, Farid was in need of this employment. For someone who lived in a small town like Antelius, being a police officer was more than simply a job. It was a future. Not only did it pay well, but it was also respected, and for Farid, it was the basis around which he was constructing his entire existence with his life. He was responsible for a family and a future that he needed to ensure. There was no way that I could let this position go. In other words, if that meant patrolling a deserted beach in the midst of a winter storm, then that is exactly what he would do without hesitation. He acknowledged that there were going to be aspects of the job that would be quite inconvenient for him. To put it simply, he was completely unaware of how miserable this particular evening was going to become. It was a phone call that brought them out here in the first place. This was the reason why they were here. Someone had called the station a little while ago, and their voice was hurried and a little bit scared because of the situation. They reported that they had saw something peculiar lying on the beach, close to the waterline. Despite the fact that they were unsure of what it was, they thought it appeared to be a person when viewed in the dim light. It is a body. At this point, Antelius was a tranquil location. The occurrence of violent crime was virtually unheard of. There were more than just bodies that were discovered washed up on the strand. In light of this, Farid and his companion were skeptical as they made their way through the sand, their flashlight beams making unsteady circles in the darkness. According to Farid, it was most likely just some trash that had washed up on the shore, or it could have been a gigantic dead marine monster. It was more than anything else that he was irritated. Being called out into this storm for something that was almost certainly going to be of no consequence seemed like a waste of time during that moment. The idea that they were going to discover a human body on the beach was completely out of the question. Then, however, as they continued to stroll, something drew the attention of their lights. A shadowy figure was laying unmoving on the sand at a considerable distance from the beach. It was nothing more than a lump in the darkness, a mere item. Nevertheless, even from a much greater distance, there was an indisputably human quality to its appearance. This was the perfect shape. This was the perfect size. There was an instantaneous disappearance of the annoyance that Farid had been experiencing, and in its stead was a chilly knot of dread in his stomach. This was the end. This is what the person who called came upon. He and his partner shared a glance with one another. They chose not to flee. You do not behave in such manner. You have no idea who or what is waiting for you at this moment. In the event that this was in fact a person, and if something unfortunate had occurred to them, the person responsible might still be in the vicinity, keeping a watchful eye from the rocks or the dunes. They moved at a measured pace as they approached each other carefully. They continued to keep their headlamps on, looking at everything from the breaking waves on one side to the dark and murky dunes on the other side of the region. But there was nobody on the beach. Anything else that was out of place was not present. The only things that could be seen on the sand in front of them were the wind, the rain, and that solitary person. Farid's expertise as a police officer took control as they approached closer, but his mind was still having trouble accepting what his eyes were witnessing. Now, he was able to make out additional details. The physical form of a torso, arms, and legs. This is most certainly a person, he thought to himself. In the sand, there is a body that is resting on its back. On the other hand, there was a peculiarity about it. The manner in which it was laid was not natural in any sense. He was unable to pinpoint exactly what it was, but the proportions did not seem to be quite right. Simply put, the silhouette was unexpected. At long last, the individuals were standing immediately above it. In order to shed light on the situation, they directed both of their flashlight beams downward. and it was at that precise time that Farid realized why the body had appeared to be so peculiar. I have no doubt that it was a person. The body of a man was found there, but he was very lacking in his head. The scene was shocking to see. There was no longer any possibility that the person had drowned by accident or suffered some other kind of catastrophe. The decapitation revealed a story that was both plain and terrible. It was a murderous act. Someone had murdered this man, subjected him to this heinous act, and then either dumped his body on this beach or tossed him into the water so that he would wash up on the coast. The most heinous form of foul play was being committed here. Farid and his companion plunged straight into the process, despite the fact that their hearts were beating extremely fast. It was necessary for them to safeguard the scene. As they drew their service guns, the metal was cold and heavy in their hands, and they conducted a search that was both more extensive and more comprehensive in the local vicinity. There was a search conducted behind the rocks, in the sand dunes, and anywhere else that someone might be hiding. But there was no one present. With the exception of the two of them and the gloomy discovery that was lying at their feet, the beach was entirely quiet and empty. They returned to the body while the rain continued to fall, and the light from their flashlights created a small, isolated bubble of light in the wide blackness that surrounded them. The two of them began conversing, their voices low and intense, as they attempted to determine what their next step would be. Now, you need to keep in mind that this took place in a little community in Lebanon in the middle of the 1960s. Their law enforcement agency was not a large high-tech enterprise that covered a large area. A small force with few resources, they were a formidable adversary. They were unable to call for assistance or notify a forensics team because they did not have radios. They were just unable to provide the kind of comprehensive response that would be expected in the event of a homicide in the modern era. It would be necessary for one of them to really walk all the way back to the station, file a report, and rally the other police in order to initiate any kind of inquiry. It was a laborious and time-consuming process. On top of that, killings were so uncommon in this area that they did not even have a conventional procedure for dealing with them. In a very literal sense, they were making it up as they went along to get what they wanted. As they stood over the body and discussed the various choices available to them, a plan started to take shape. To do so was the only reasonable course of action. It was necessary for one of them to remain here with the body. In order to ensure that the murderer would not return for any reason, they were required to keep a watchful eye on the crime scene and make certain that it was not altered in any way. It would be necessary for the other officer to make the arduous journey back to the station in order to initiate the formal investigation. By the time dawn rolled around, the objective was to have a full team of investigators back here. On the other hand, this meant that one of them would have to spend the entire night on this icy, storm-tossed beach by themselves next to a headless body. The two officers exchanged glances with one another. Both back then and now, it was a rule that was never explicitly stated. All of the challenging tasks are given to the junior man. Farid was the inferior officer in the hierarchy. It was immediately apparent that he was going to be the one to take on this dreadful responsibility. He recalled the things that he had always told himself about this work from the beginning. He was in need of it, despite the fact that it would be uncomfortable. He was in need of the income. It didn't matter how terrible the responsibility was, he couldn't afford to lose his job because he refused to perform it. In response, Farid simply nodded his head as his companion looked at him with a questioning expression on his face. He said, "Fine," with his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm fine. I'll stay here. I'll watch the body. You go get the investigation started. I'll see you in the morning." After his buddy had departed, Farid felt the whole weight of the situation come crashing down on him. His silhouette was swiftly swallowed up by the rain and the darkness. Now he was all by himself. His realization of what he was going to have to accomplish over the next few hours was a terrifying experience. There were other factors at play as well, such as the bitterly low temperatures and the pouring rain. The fact that he was standing guard over a person who had been murdered was the catalyst. This barren expanse of sand was an area that he was sharing with a deceased individual. In addition to that, there was the persistent and nagging fear that was present. There is a possibility that the individual who committed this crime, who murdered this man and severed his head, is still at large. It was true that they had conducted a search, but it was not absolutely certain that the murderer was not hiding someplace close and keeping an eye on him. It was not the cold that caused the shiver to run down his spine, rather it was the thought that caused it. What would happen if they returned? What would happen if they desired to influence the body in a different way? What would happen if they regarded him as a potential danger or a witness who needed to be suppressed? Farid was currently protecting the evidence, but he was also a possible target for the investigation. It was the stuff that nightmares are made of. Still, he made an effort to stabilize himself. Reminding himself that he had been trained as a police officer, he said. In no way was he helpless. He was holding his assigned handgun, which was securely ensconced in its holster. On his belt was the service knife that he carried. If someone did emerge from the shadows with the intention of attacking him, he would be able to protect himself. He was capable of holding his own. This was a mantra that he chanted to himself over and over again in order to combat the fear. The hours passed by glacially. There was never a sign of relief. Farid felt the force of it pressing down on him, and he shook violently. It was expected of him to remain cautious, keeping a watchful eye on the crime scene and being aware. On the contrary, sleep was not even a possibility. On the other hand, he was so miserable, so thoroughly fatigued, and so incredibly cold. In an effort to preserve the meager amount of body heat that he still possessed, he found himself lowering down onto the wet sand, drawing his knees to his chest, and putting his arms around himself. In the midst of this pitiful circumstance, all he was doing was attempting to locate a sliver of solace. And he did that at some point in time. In spite of the fact that he was freezing and terrified, as well as the fact that there was a dead body only a few feet away, he became so comfortable that his body betrayed him. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning when Farid Jabber finally succumbed to sleep. After some time had passed, he suddenly awoke with a start. The pounding of his heart could be felt in his chest. Suddenly, he was overcome with a rush of utter panic. It was immediately apparent to him that he had committed a grave error. It was not appropriate for him to go to sleep. During the course of the inquiry into the murder, he was meant to be protecting the body, which is the single most significant piece of evidence of all. He recalled his anxiety about the possibility that the murderer may return. Additionally, he had just dozed off, leaving the location in a state of utter vulnerability. His thoughts were racing as he struggled to get to his feet. His eyes swept the area. It was still dark, it was still raining, and the temperature was quite chilly. His flashlight was directed at the location where the body was supposed to be, and he turned around to face it. And there was no one present at the location. The physique had vanished. Fear was his first instinct, and it was pure and basic. The perpetrator of the crime was present. It is likely that they sneaked up on him while he was sleeping and managed to steal his body. Perhaps they are still in the vicinity. Without thinking, he grabbed for his firearm, and his hand went to the holster that was attached to his hip. But the only thing his fingertips discovered was leather that was empty. He had his revolver removed from his holster, which was exposed. Suddenly, the horror was a reality now. He had been left to watch a crime scene, and in the span of a few hours, he had been able to disarm himself and find the body of the person who had been murdered. It was the end of his career. This man was a shame. However, at this moment, his primary priority was to ensure his own survival. Even though the murderer had been here close enough to steal his pistol, it is possible that he is still keeping an eye on him. Thankfully, he was still in possession of his knife. He removed it from its sheath, the blade shining brightly in the dim light that was present. Only that was left for him to do. He gripped it firmly while his eyes darted around the beach, which was at night. Where do I begin? Frantically, he pondered about it. Do you know where the body is? Where can I find my firearm? As soon as he realized the dreadful truth, his mind began searching for plausible reasons, anything other than the truth. Perhaps it was an animal, he pondered. Perhaps a giant animal emerged and pulled the body away from the scene. Through the use of his flashlight, he searched the sand for any signs of drag marks. In contrast, there was nothing. Although part of it would have been washed away by the rain, there ought to have been some evidence of it. Aside from that, what kind of animal would remove a handgun from its holster after carefully unclipping it? It was completely illogical. After then, he had another thought. The current. It's possible that a strong wave had collided with the shore, snatched the body, and then dragged it back out into the ocean. Both the absence of drag marks and the fact that it had vanished would be explained by this. But he looked at the spot where he had been resting, which was only a few feet away from the location where the body had been. In the event that a wave that was large enough to move the body of a fully grown man had come up, it would have most certainly hit him as well. It would have saturated him while simultaneously waking him up in an instant. Once more, it did not provide an explanation for the missing gun. A gun that was protected by a holster could not be removed by a wave. At long last, the horrifying realization entered the picture. One answer was the only one that could account for all of the data. Someone had arrived at this location while he was sleeping. A person had picked up the body and relocated it to a different location. During the time that he was sleeping, someone had reached over him and seized his gun. For the entirety of the night, he had been dreading the worst-case scenario, and it had finally come true. The perpetrator of the crime had made his return, and he had slept through it all. It was earlier that night, before Fareed and his partner had even arrived, and this is what had actually taken place earlier that evening. An individual by the name of Habib Jabber, who was Fareed's own cousin, had been strolling down the beach by himself. Perhaps he was just going for a walk to get his thoughts organized, but we don't know for sure why he was there. On the other hand, he was assaulted while he was there. A person ambushed him with the intention of robbing him. The thief ended up killing Habib after something went wrong, which led to a struggle between the two of them. Next, the murderer severed Habib's head, either out of a state of fear or possibly for some other more sinister motive. Although he left his headless body on the sand, he removed the head of Habib as well as the money that he had stolen, and then he returned to his home, which was located in close proximity to the beach. However, after a few hours had passed, the murderer began to feel anxious as he was sitting in his home. He was sorry for his error. The decision to abandon the body was a poor one. It was a substantial piece of evidence that could be identified as belonging to him with relative ease. His decision was that he needed to return. The body needed to be retrieved and disposed of in the appropriate manner, and he needed to get rid of all the evidence for good. So he walked back to the beach, which was the location where the crime had occurred. On the other hand, when he arrived, he witnessed something that caused his blood to turn ice cold. Not only was the body no longer by itself, it was now being protected by a law enforcement officer. Fareed Jabber, the victim's cousin, was the officer who was responsible for the murder, even though the perpetrator was unaware of this fact. It is essential to comprehend that Fareed was unaware of the identity of the victim during the entirety of this narrative. All he was aware of was the fact that a man had been killed in the incident. It was impossible for him to identify the body as belonging to his own cousin, Habib, because the head was missing from the body. The only thing he thought was that it was a stranger. Now, when the murderer noticed Fareed standing watch, his initial reaction was to turn around and flee the dangerous situation. It was a failure of his plan. It was impossible for him to reach the body. However, he made the decision to creep a little bit closer in order to observe what was taking place. In addition, while he observed the scene from the shadows, he came to an astounding realization. It was discovered that Fareed, the police officer, had slept off while on the job. He was given the opportunity. Keeping a low profile, the murderer approached the scene of the crime in complete silence. During the time that Fareed was sleeping, he picked up the body of Habib and carried it away, heading back towards his house at the extremity of the beach. Following that, he returned for a second time. It was then that he realized Farid, who was still asleep, had a service weapon concealed in his holster. This was an opportunity that he simply could not let go of. With great care and in complete silence, he removed the clip from the holster, eased the revolver out, and then took it as well. The fact that Farid was outwitted and disarmed by the murderer while he was sleeping is, in all actuality, the worst thing that he could have possibly imagined happening to him. The killer had now brought the body, the head, and Farid's gun back to his house, which was located farther down the beach. In his latest scheme, he intended to ignite a massive fire and destroy everything. The evidence should be completely destroyed. As a result, he began making preparations. Immediately, he reached for an axe and started chopping up firewood right there at the edge of the beach, not too far away from where Farid was resting. At that very instant, when the murderer was chopping wood, Farid awoke in a condition of complete and utter panic, having come to the realization that both his body and his pistol had vanished entirely. He was in a state of utter desperation. Eventually, he was able to spot him despite the rain. Chopping wood is a man who may be seen at the very end of the beach. This man was completely unknown to Farid at this point. There was no doubt in his mind that he was unaware that this was the individual who had just committed the murder of his cousin and taken his service weapon. In Farid's eyes, this was nothing more than a man who lived in the neighborhood. Farid's head, however, was filled with an idea as he struggled to find a solution. He lives in such close proximity to the location of the incident. Possibly, he witnessed something. Perhaps he picked up on something. Assuming he was able to assist him in locating the deceased individual and his firearm, he might be able to save his career. As a result, Farid began going along the beach while holding his own service knife. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was about to come face to face with the person who had murdered his cousin. Let's fast forward a few hours to the morning of the following day. At long last, the storm had subsided, and a light that was a light gray in color was seen spreading across the sky. Farid's companion went back to the shore, and this time he wasn't wandering about by himself. Additionally, he was accompanied by a small group of investigators who were prepared to initiate the official investigation. As they got closer to the location, his companion peered down the beach and noticed a solitary individual standing on the sand near to what appeared to be a decapitated body lying on the ground. In the beginning, he experienced a rush of relief. First, there was Farid, and then there was the body, he thought to himself. The scene is safe to be in. The appearance is exactly the same as it was when I left it. However, as they became closer to one another, the partner began to become aware of things that were not right. Squinting, he attempted to make sense of what he was seeing by focusing his eyes. It was wearing the improper clothes when the body was found lying on the ground. The victim had been wearing clothes that were completely different from what they had been wearing the previous evening. He had no doubts about it. Where did this place come from? This intriguing disparity was just the beginning of the situation. When the partner and the detectives eventually arrived at the body and got a close look at it, it was impossible to deny why they had found it. This was not the same body that had been found the previous evening. The clothing was not the only factor. Someone else was the one in question. Despite the fact that the partner was unaware of it at the time, this was not the body of Farid's cousin. However, it was determined that it was not Farid's body. At that very moment, Farid was standing right there next to it, seeming pale and very fatigued. In point of fact, it would come out that the scene that morning appeared to be was almost entirely different from what it actually was. Together with the detectives, the partner was required to spend the remainder of the day conducting a thorough investigation of the entire beach as well as the village that was adjacent to it. They also had to conduct dozens of interviews with anyone who might have seen or heard anything. Piece by excruciating piece, they pieced together the story in a slow and methodical manner. And because the fact that they discovered was so odd and so perverted, it would soon become a topic of discussion in newspapers all across the world. For the reason that Farid had approached the man who was chopping wood when he was walking down that beach, he was so overwhelmed by his desire to keep his work that he had approached him When he had questioned him if he had seen anything weird, he had inquired as to whether or not he knew what had happened to the body that had been there just a few hours before. Undoubtedly, the man pretended to be a fool. Yes, he was the murderer. He had no intention of admitting guilt. In addition, while they were standing there conversing, Farid's thoughts started to construct a new concept that was extremely dreadful. His life was ruined. It was the end of his career. But then, he turned his attention to this stranger, this man who was standing on a beach that was completely empty. Nobody else was in the vicinity. Not a single witness was present. Farid was still in possession of his knife. During that time of complete and utter dread and the need to protect himself, he made a terrible decision. In his mind, he pondered, what if I simply replace the body? Nobody will ever be aware of it. That is just what Farid did in this situation. It was with his knife that he attacked the man, and he ended up killing him. After that, in a gruesome reiteration of the initial act, he severed his head from his body and dragged it back to the beach where it had been at the beginning. In an effort to save his own employment, he was attempting to construct the scenario in such a way that it appeared as though nothing had changed. When his colleague and the cops came, he was standing there close to the body of the man he had just killed. He had only just finished killing him. He was going to act as if he had been watching over the situation during the entire night. However, Farid had no way of knowing that the random man he picked to kill in order to cover up his error was not at all a random man. He had no means of knowing this beforehand. It was the same individual who had just a few hours earlier been responsible for the death of his cousin, Habib. It was completely unknown to Farid. When he was trying to save himself, he believed that he was killing a total stranger. However, in a surprising and inexplicable turn of events, he had genuinely and unintentionally avenged the death of his cousin. Nevertheless, the fact that justice had been delivered in a convoluted and circuitous manner did not alter the reality of the situation. Even yet, Farid Jabber had committed the heinous crime of murdering a man. He was taken into custody for the crime of murder. His frantic effort to rescue his work had not only been unsuccessful, but it had also transformed him into a murderer himself, destroying the very life that he had been so terrified of losing. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up? There is a very common saying that curiosity killed the cat. But in the real world, curiosity and desperate necessity can lead humans into places they have no business being. Today, we are going to look at 3 completely different places on our planet where humanity has drawn a very clear line in the sand. These are places marked by warning signs, towering fences, or terrifying reputations where people are told in no uncertain terms that if they cross this boundary, they are stepping into a realm where they are no longer at the top of the food chain. In these places, the dangers are not just environmental. They are living, breathing entities or mysterious physical forces that can swallow a person whole without leaving a single trace behind. Yet, whether it is for the taste of forbidden fruit, the thrill of exploring the unknown deep, or simply the desperate need to feed a family in the face of crushing poverty, people still cross those lines. When they do, the results are almost always devastating. To understand this first story, we have to travel off the coast of mainland Southeast Asia, out into the vast blue waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Here lies the country of Indonesia, which is actually the largest archipelago in the entire world. It is made up of 17,508 individual islands. To give you some perspective on just how massive this area is, if you were to measure from the westernmost point of the very first island to the easternmost point of the last island, it would stretch for 5,000 kilometers right across the equator. Many of these islands are incredibly tiny, completely uninhabited, and they look totally unremarkable from a distance. If you were looking at one particular island, located about 2,500 kilometers north of Australia, You might think it is just another beautiful tropical escape. But this island holds a very dark and dangerous secret. On this island, there are about 2,000 people living in small, isolated communities. These people are the direct descendants of former convicts who were exiled to this remote spot generations ago. And they have to share their home with a predator that is endemic to this specific island. This predator is a direct descendant of flesh-eating dinosaurs. This creature can grow up to 10 feet long and can weigh as much as 350 pounds. It has a sensory system that is so incredibly developed that it can taste blood in the air from up to 9 kilometers away. In fact, these creatures are so good at smelling blood and death that whenever there is a burial on this island, the locals have to place massive, heavy boulders over the grave sites. If they do not, these creatures will come running out of the thick jungle, dig up the freshly deceased, and eat them. This creature is the Komodo dragon. Now, a Komodo dragon has a savage bite, and they certainly have the strength and the teeth to rip a human being completely in two. But the way they hunt is actually much more sinister. They do not typically bite to kill their prey on the spot. Instead, they bite to create a massive, deep flesh wound, and then they inject a highly toxic venom directly into the wound site. This venom prevents the blood from clotting and sends the victim into shock. This clever and terrifying adaptation allows the Komodo dragon to avoid expending a ton of energy chasing down their prey. They basically just bite you once, poison you, and then they walk away. They will follow you at a distance, waiting for up to 24 hours for you to slowly weaken and die, and then they will close in and eat you. They are strict carnivores with a truly voracious appetite. A single Komodo dragon can eat up to 80% of its own body weight in a single day. The locals have watched these monsters bite goats and then literally eat them whole by opening their jaws incredibly wide and ramming the goat's body against a tree trunk to force it down their throats. But when goats, sheep, and wild buffalo are not enough to satisfy their constant hunger, these dragons will start eating each other. Cannibalism is so common among Komodo dragons that their young actually spend the first 4 years of their lives hiding high up in the trees. They do this because if an adult Komodo dragon, even their own parent, spots them on the ground, they will be eaten immediately. On top of all of this, these creatures can climb trees, run incredibly fast, and swim faster than any human can. This is their kingdom, and it is called Komodo Island. Back in 2009, a 31-year-old local fisherman named Muhammad Anwar was living on this island. He had grown up there, so he was highly aware of the dangers. He knew the rules, and he knew where not to go. But on this particular day, Muhammad wanted some fruit. Normally, he would just walk outside of his house and pick some of the apples that grew nearby. But for a long time, he had been tantalized by the sugar apple trees that grew inside a heavily fenced-off section of the island. This area was known by the locals as the Forbidden Section. This section was, of course, teeming with Komodo dragons, and as a result, the locals basically fenced it off and said, "We do not go over there, and they do not come over here." But Muhammad had always wanted those sugar apples. He had grown up here and had never got to have one. So, on this day, for whatever reason, he decided, today is the day I am going to get one. He went over to the fence and looked out. There was some fairly tall grass, so he could not see what was on the immediate other side of this fence, but it was pretty open and he could see the trees in the distance. After looking around and feeling like the coast was clear, he hopped the fence and ran out to the sugar apple tree. But what Muhammad did not realize was that his neighbor, Teresa Tawa, was outside and happened to look over at him right as he hopped the fence into the forbidden section. Teresa ran over to the fence and yelled to him to come back, but he did not hear her. So she stood at the fence looking out, scanning the area herself to see if there were any Komodo dragons out there. She did not see any, so she watched him, hoping he would just get the apples and come back without incident. As she was watching, she saw him reaching out and extending his arm just far enough to get one more apple, but then he lost his footing and fell to the ground. From her perspective, she could not see Muhammad on the ground because the tall grass obscured him. She did not know if he was laying there unconscious or if he was just rolling around in pain and about to stand up. She stood there anxiously, hoping he would stand up soon, and then she heard the sound of two Komodo dragons running through the tall grass. You could see the grass moving as these two massive creatures ran and grunted at full speed towards Muhammad. When he fell, he had cut himself, and they smelled his blood and charged over. Teresa could only scream and yell for help as these two Komodo dragons ate Muhammad. The authorities were able to get out there pretty quickly, and they were able to get the Komodo dragons off before they actually consumed him, but he was already dead. Today, you can actually go to Komodo Island as a tourist, but it costs you $1,000 to get a membership fee, and then once you get there, you are only allowed to be in a few different sections that are totally regulated, and you are really not anywhere near the Komodo dragons because it really is extremely dangerous. On the evening of June 20th, 1965, 4 high school friends set off for a remote desert location about 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, Nevada, that was within the very famous Death Valley. They arrived at their destination, which, if you did not know any better, would just look like the middle of nowhere in the desert. But to them, they knew exactly where they were. So they parked their car, got out, and began unloading very heavy underwater diving equipment and began walking it up a nearby hill. The group was made up of 19-year-old Paul Giancontieri, his brother-in-law, 20-year-old David Rose, 19-year-old Bill Alter, and his younger brother, Jack, who was 16 years old. As these 4 boys walked their diving equipment up this hill, they were hit with sign after sign after sign that was telling them, do not go any farther, turn around. They made it to the top of the hill, and they were met with a huge fence, which once again said, do not go any farther. Without any hesitation, they went right under the fence and began walking down the other side, which was a very steep 30-foot rocky slope that led down to this very narrow strip of water. This water was the entrance to a very famous underground cave called the Devil's Hole. Their plan was to dive all the way down to the bottom of the cave, which was at 325 feet. So they got down to the bottom of the hill and they began putting on their scuba gear. But Jack, the youngest, started having second thoughts. He told them he did not want to do this anymore. They told him to suit himself, and so Jack volunteered himself to sit on the outside and be their lookout, while the other 3, Paul, David, and Bill, went ahead with the dive. They put on the rest of their equipment and hopped into the warm water, which stays at about 92 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. They checked their flashlights a couple of times, and when they were ready, signaled to each other and began their descent down into the dark abyss of the Devil's Hole. For the next couple of hours, Jack just sat on the surface, waiting for his brother and his 2 friends to return. Just after midnight, David and Bill did return, but Paul did not. When David and Bill got to the surface, they asked Jack if he had seen Paul because they got separated on the way up and figured he was already up there. Jack said that he had not seen Paul at all. David and Bill looked at each other and knew they had a major problem, so they decided they had to go back down immediately. They put their regulators back in and swam back down. Bill would later say that when they went back down to look for Paul, David was leading and was going really fast. It was pitch black down there, and Bill only had his flashlight to see David, who was creating separation and getting farther and farther away. Bill had no way to stop him, and at some point he lost him completely. David was just gone. Bill, not wanting to turn this into an even bigger problem, stopped where he was and went back to the surface. He and his brother Jack sat there anxiously waiting for David and Paul to return, but they did not. At some point, Jack went and got the authorities. When the police got the report about the 2 missing divers inside Devil's Hole, they contacted a guy named Jim Hoots, who was a professional diver who regularly dove inside Devil's Hole. He was very familiar with it, and they got him on scene within a few hours to go looking for these guys. Originally, the hope was that Paul and David had found their way into a section of Devil's Hole called Brown's Room, which was a big air pocket where, in an emergency situation, they might have found refuge. Jim and his dive partner got to the edge of Devil's Hole, put on their gear, and hopped in. They began their descent into the total darkness using their powerful lights. They went down about 90 feet to where the tunnel basically funnels down to a narrow point. You have to wriggle through and push through this tight section, and once you get through that, you enter into a massive chasm. If you shine your light in any direction, the walls are so far away that it looks like you are shining a light into infinity. To get to Brown's room, they needed to push through that little funnel and then immediately turn left and track the ceiling until they found a tunnel that goes back up again. That tunnel is very tight and claustrophobia-inducing, but if you take it 90 feet back up, you get to Brown's room. Jim and his partner made their way up this tunnel and got to the air pocket, but there were no divers there. So they went back down through the tunnel and into that huge chasm. They knew that if the boys were not in the air pocket, they were going to go down further to see if they could find them on the lower ledge. The lower ledge was a rocky outcropping about halfway down to the bottom of the cave. It was a natural break point before you went to the bottom. As they descended in this infinity chasm, Jim was shining his flashlight in every direction looking for signs of these guys, and at some point, his light picked up a reflection on the lower ledge. They got down to the lower ledge and saw that the reflection was from the glass of a dive mask sitting right on the rocks. Next to it was a single dive fin. Jim and his partner picked these items up, went back to the surface, and confirmed with Jack and Bill Alter that the mask and fin indeed belonged to David and Paul. Afterwards, they told the search party that the boys were not in Brown's room, and since they would have run out of air by now, it was safe to say they were deceased. Jim and his partner wanted to go back in and go all the way to the bottom to confirm if their bodies were down there. They got back in the water, went down the 90 feet, wriggled through the narrow section, and descended past the lower ledge all the way down to 325 feet. But as they scanned the bottom, they saw absolutely nothing. There were no bodies, no equipment, nothing. It was at this point that Jim noticed a little hole in the bottom of the cave floor, barely big enough for a full-size person with tanks to fit through. When he got to the edge, he felt a strong current pulling his legs down into this hole. It was like a drain on a bathtub when the plug is pulled. Jim and his dive buddy pushed themselves back to avoid getting sucked in, and Jim pulled out a weighted piece of string that was 932 feet long. He let this line go inside of this hole, and it went all the way down to 932 feet without touching any surface, meaning the hole was at least that deep. Jim pulled his line back up, looked at his partner, and they both decided not to go down there. They knew that if they went in, the current was so strong they would never get back out. They went back to the surface and explained that the divers had likely developed nitrogen narcosis, got disoriented in a drunken state, and were pulled into this hole by the suction before they could stop themselves. To this day, their bodies have never been found, and scientists still do not know how deep that hole is. But in 2012, an earthquake in Mexico, 2,000 miles away from Devil's Hole, caused a tsunami to come through Devil's Hole. Scientists believe that hole leads to an underground ocean that connects to other parts of the world as far away as 2,000 miles. Today, diving is still strictly forbidden inside Devil's Hole. Pearly Beach is a beautiful little beach town in South Africa that is very popular amongst tourists. There is lots of snorkeling, whale watching, and horseback riding on the beach. But behind this beautiful vacation town, down a bumpy access road going inland, you come to an unmarked settlement called Oluxalweni. This place is the exact opposite of a vacation resort. Basically, everyone there is completely impoverished. Beyond some seasonal cleaning jobs and the occasional gardening job, there is virtually no work in that area. As a result of this crushing poverty, the men in this town have had to take on one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. It is called abalone poaching. Abalone are a very rare type of shellfish that are illegal to be captured and sold, but there is a booming illicit market for them, with the primary customers being the Chinese, who view eating abalone as a status food. Abalone can only be harvested by hand, and one of the very few places you can find them is on Dyer Island, which is 3 kilometers off the coast of Pearly Beach. So the men of unexplained have become the primary labor force to go collect these shellfish for this illegal trade. On a really good night, these poachers will come back and make the equivalent of a couple hundred US, and they will use that money to support their entire family. This is the one thing that generates money in their community, so the young men are willing to take the ultimate risk. You are probably wondering what makes this particular job one of the most dangerous in the world. Well, it has nothing to do with the actual act of removing the abalone. It is the creature that lurks below you the whole time you are in the water. In the early morning hours of September 3rd, 2017, a group of poachers met on Pearly Beach to make their way out to Dyer Island. Because they are so poor, they do not have the money to rent a boat, so they swim the 3 kilometers out there. It takes them about 3 hours to swim out. Then they stay there for 3 hours, going down on a breath hold over and over again, pulling abalones off the reef, and then they swim 3 hours back. This particular day, they were pulling up their wetsuits, chatting nervously, and trying not to talk about the sharks. One of the men was 34-year-old Zalela, who had taken a break from poaching because of the danger, but he had just found out his wife was pregnant and needed the extra cash. South Africa is home to the largest population of great white sharks in the world, and there is a stretch of water between Dyer Island and Pearly Beach called Shark Alley, which has the highest concentration of great whites on the planet. So every time they made this trip, they had to swim over Shark Alley, harvest abalone right where the sharks hunt for seals, and then swim back. That morning, Zalela and the other poachers made it out past the breakers and headed out to a stretch of kelp that covered the first third of their trip. They stayed in this kelp field because they believed the sharks did not like to go in there. But at some point, they reached the end of the kelp, and what lay ahead was the open water swim to Dyer Island. This was the most dangerous part. Zalela was the first person to enter the open water. The way they did this was by intentionally spacing themselves out by a couple of meters so that if one of them was attacked, the others would have a chance to swim away. As they swam, they would constantly look around and count the people they were with, because these shark attacks often happened silently from below. The second swimmer was swimming along, counting heads, and suddenly realized that Zalela was missing. He yelled for the others to stop. As they looked around, Zalela re-emerged in the mouth of a massive great white shark that was violently shaking him side to side. Zalela was screaming out, and the other poachers, knowing they could not do anything to help him, turned and swam back to the kelp as fast as they could. Behind them, they heard his final screams and the violent thrashing of the water. Once the survivors made it back into the thick kelp field, one of them pulled out a cell phone wrapped in rubber and called a local poaching boat. They did not call the police or the Coast Guard because they could not risk being arrested and losing their livelihood. The boat came and scooped them up, and they were able to recover Zalela's remains from the surface to bring them back for a funeral. According to police reports, only 5 poachers have been killed by sharks there in 2 decades. But the locals say that count is not even close to accurate. Because they never report these attacks to the police, they believe the actual number is closer to 2 or 3 dozen deaths. When interviewed, the poachers say that whenever there is an attack, they will take a week or 2 off, but then they go right back in the water. Poverty gives them no other choice. This harsh reality shows the desperate lengths to which people will go when they are pushed to the brink of survival, knowing that every single dive could be their very last. They must put their fears aside and face the ocean's greatest monsters simply to put food on the table for their families, creating a never-ending cycle of danger and tragic loss. When we look at these three stories, we are forced to confront the absolute fragility of human life in the face of nature's most extreme environments and predators. On Komodo Island, the line is a physical fence that separates human communities from the domain of the venomous, flesh-eating descendants of dinosaurs. In the depths of Devil's Hole, the boundary is a chain-link fence and a steep rock face, warning divers of an endless water-filled chasm and an invisible, deadly current. And on the beaches of South Africa, the line is the edge of a protective kelp forest, beyond which lies an open channel swarming with the world's most concentrated population of great white sharks. In all three cases, these boundaries are set up to protect people, to keep them safe from forces they cannot control. But human desire, curiosity, and sheer desperation are incredibly powerful motivators that can easily override the fear of death. Mohammed Anwar simply wanted to taste a sweet fruit he had never had before, a small pleasure in a life of hard work. Paul Giancontieri and David Rose wanted the ultimate thrill of exploring the deep, unknown secrets of the earth, pushing past boundaries just to see what was on the other side. And Zalela was driven by the deep, protective instinct of a father who wanted to make sure his unborn child and pregnant wife would have a chance to survive. Their motivations were completely different, but they all led to the exact same place: a confrontation with a danger they could not escape. These tragic events leave a haunting resonance on the families and communities left behind. On Komodo Island, the villagers still watch the tall grass with caution, knowing the dragons are always watching. In the desert of Death Valley, the quiet waters of Devil's Hole look peaceful from the surface, showing no sign of the two teenage boys who were pulled down into the mysterious depths 50 years ago, leaving their families with unanswered questions that will never be solved. And in the impoverished settlement of Oluxulwani, the young men continue to prepare for their dangerous swims, knowing the risks, but having no other way to survive. It makes you realize that sometimes the lines we are told never to cross are there for a reason, and once you take that step over the boundary, there is no turning back. The frightening part about these stories is that none of these people expected their day to end the way it did. They were simply chasing curiosity, adventure, or survival. If you enjoy true stories about the strange, dark, and mysterious, there's another one waiting for you right now. Go ahead and click it, and I'll see you in the next story. Until next time, see ya!